We welcome you back to this channel. This time we will explore 3 tales of terror in cemeteries. A young man and his girlfriend who challenge the paranormal, a caretaker who faces a specter, and a group of friends who unearth deadly secrets. Go ahead, turn off the lights, and let's take one more step into the world of the unknown. The first story takes us to discover what happens when a group of friends explores a local cemetery. Amid ghostly cries and a figure with glowing eyes, one of them falls into a trance and reveals the story of a woman buried alive.
Crying and visions.
I don't want to give my name or much personal information, but I can't keep to myself what I experienced that night in the cemetery. A few days ago, my friends and I found a disturbing video on YouTube of some boys in a local cemetery where they experienced paranormal events. The strangest thing was that the video disappeared the next day, removed without any explanation. One of my friends suggested that we go to the same cemetery to see if we could experience something similar. Armed with flashlights and our cell phones, we headed to the old cemetery in the town. The night was cold, and a thick fog covered the place, giving it an even more sinister atmosphere. We walked among the tombstones in silence, our flashlights illuminating only a few meters ahead of us. At first, everything was calm. We walked among the mausoleums without any unusual experiences. But then, the crying started. A soft sound, almost imperceptible at first, turned into a persistent wail that seemed to come from all directions. We stopped, trying to locate its origin, but only managed to make ourselves more nervous. One of my friends became very uneasy and pointed towards a distant grave, asking if we could see that. Through the fog, a dark figure peeked out from behind a headstone and disappeared immediately. The figure was tall and thin, with old worn clothes that floated as if weightless. Its face was shrouded in shadows, but its eyes glowed with a cold, piercing light that paralyzed us with fear. We decided to move in another direction, our hearts pounding. Suddenly, we saw the same ghostly figure crossing behind several tombstones. As it passed, the flowers on those graves fell to the ground, as if pushed by an invisible hand. The temperature dropped drastically, and I felt a shiver run down my spine. Suddenly, another one of my friends started behaving strangely. His eyes seemed glassy, as if he were in a trance. Without saying a word, he began to walk towards a specific grave. We tried to stop him, but it was as if he couldn't hear us. When he reached the grave, he knelt down and started murmuring something inaudible, followed by a horrible sobbing. Suddenly, he began to dig the grave desperately with his hands. We all grabbed him, and in an instant he collapsed, losing consciousness. The situation became desperate. We shouted his name while trying to revive him. We decided that enough was enough. We carried him and began to run towards the cemetery exit. Around us, the wailing intensified, and that same ghostly figure seemed to be following us. Finally, we reached the entrance and only stopped when we were outside the cemetery. My friend regained consciousness but was pale and trembling. He told us that while he was unconscious, he had a vision of the tragic death of that ghostly figure. He saw a woman who had been buried alive by mistake, hearing her desperate screams as she clawed at the coffin lid until her hands bled, and finally, she died of asphyxiation. We returned home as quickly as we could. Once home, we checked our cell phones. All the videos and photos we had taken were completely black, except for one photo. In that single image, you could clearly see a dark figure among the tombstones, with bright eyes watching us. The image left us frozen. We didn't know what we experienced that night, and honestly, none of us want to try something like that again. Since then, we've avoided passing by the cemetery, especially at night. We're glad it was only a big scare, and that we got out without major consequences. Later, we found out that one of the boys from the original video had terrible experiences after his visit, which caused his channel to be shut down, as they, like us, didn't want to try it again.
In our second story, a young man and his girlfriend dare to cross a cemetery at midnight. What seemed like a shortcut turns into a nightmare when an invisible force marks the young woman, leading her to a terrifying exorcism.
under the tree.
The elders say that one should not go to cemeteries after dark, and we should listen to them because I made a big mistake by ignoring their advice. It was my best friend's birthday, and my girlfriend and I were invited. When the party ended, we decided to walk home, which was only a 20-minute walk. It was already late, around midnight. On our way home, there was a cemetery that served as a shortcut. I was in a hurry to get home, so I opted to take that path. My girlfriend quickly said no, but I insisted and kept walking. Reluctantly, she followed me in silence. Everything was quite normal when suddenly, Celine started screaming. I turned around and found her sitting and struggling to get up. I ran to her, asking what had happened. With a trembling voice, she explained that she had seen something moving among the tombstones and mausoleums, and suddenly felt someone clearly grabbing her foot while she was walking, making her fall onto one of the graves. I looked at her foot and saw something terrifying. The mark of a hand imprinted on her skin, like a burn. Terrified, I just wanted to get out of the cemetery as soon as possible. She couldn't walk due to the pain, so I lifted her in my arms and quickly started to leave the cemetery. Unexpectedly, Celine went very quiet. She was no longer screaming. Then, in a very masculine voice, she said, "Put me down." Her voice was so different and horrible that it really scared me. I didn't know what to do, but I followed my instinct and gently put her down. She just stood there and then began walking toward our house. Despite her severely injured foot, she walked with ease, which would be impossible for a normal person. I just followed her in silence. The incident in the cemetery had terrified me, and now her behavior made it worse. I followed her until she stopped and turned to look at me with a horrible expression I had never seen before, completely pale with deep dark circles under her eyes. Again, with that masculine voice, she told me not to follow her and that she would go home alone. She started to walk away, but I couldn't leave her alone in that condition, so I continued behind her, not knowing what to do. Then she stopped again, turned around, and with the most terrifying look I've seen, she screamed at me not to follow her and to go away. All I could think to do was run to my friend's house. I told him and his wife everything, and they decided to come with me to look for Celine. They were furious that I had left her, but they didn't really understand what I was trying to explain. First, we went to my house to see if she was there. The door was open, and we entered to find Celine sleeping. We were about to call a doctor when suddenly, she sat up and started moving on her burned and clearly broken foot. It was crazy. She walked so smoothly despite her injury. We didn't know how to interact with that, so we followed her. She led us back to that cemetery, went to the same grave, and sat under the tree near it. She spent the whole night there, sitting under the tree. When I tried to approach her, she looked at me with those pale eyes as if warning me not to come closer. This time, my best friend and his wife witnessed everything. They told me to contact a priest for help because it was clearly not normal behavior. I agreed with that. Eventually, Celine returned home on her own and slept throughout the next day, only to return to that same grave and sit under the tree at dusk. I contacted a priest and told him everything. He agreed to help us that same night. Upon seeing her, he told us without hesitation that she was possessed by a spirit and needed an exorcism. After that, we didn't know what happened because the priest asked us to leave him alone in the cemetery with Celine. After a few hours, we returned to the cemetery, worried since we hadn't heard anything. We found both of them unconscious. We didn't know what had happened, but the priest was injured with scratches on his face. When he woke up, the priest left quickly, not wanting to tell us anything about what had happened. Celine returned to being herself from that moment on. Well, almost. From time to time, she says she feels the need to sit under the tree of that grave and asks me not to let her leave the house.
The last story takes us to a cemetery where its new caretaker, skeptical of the paranormal, encounters a man looking for his wife. But suddenly our caretaker discovers that he has been dealing with a spirit.
The husband's visit.
Just a week had passed since I started my new job as the caretaker of the local cemetery. I had been called in to fill the position because the previous caretaker had to travel. I didn't worry much when I heard rumors that the previous caretakers had quit due to paranormal experiences and apparitions. I had always been skeptical about such things. The first few weeks went by without incident. My routine involved walking through the cemetery, making sure everything was in order, and locking it up at nightfall. However, one night, after I had already closed the cemetery and was about to leave, a man approached me. He looked very weak and gaunt. His skin was pale and wrinkled, as if he had been sick for a long time. His eyes were sunken, his cheeks noticeably hollow, giving him an almost cadaverous appearance. He wore old, worn-out clothes, a coat that had seen better days, and a hat barely concealing his sunken face. He begged me to let him in to visit his late wife, explaining that he was traveling and it was his last night in town. His voice was barely a whisper, broken by sadness and weariness. Moved by his story, I allowed him in, cautioning him not to stay too long. Minutes passed, and the man did not return. I decided to look for him, but he was nowhere to be found. I knew he couldn't have left through another gate because I was watching the only entrance. Despite searching the entire cemetery, there was no trace of him. 2 nights later, in the middle of the night, the same man appeared at the gate, asking to see his wife because it was his last night in town. Confused and somewhat irritated, I told him that had already happened the other night and asked how he had exited the cemetery. The man couldn't answer and only insisted on seeing his wife. His eyes, filled with a desperation that almost moved me, couldn't meet mine. I decided to let him in again, but this time I followed him from a distance. I watched as he approached one of the graves and stood there for a moment. My heart pounded as I observed him from the shadows. Suddenly I saw something I will never forget. The man began sinking into the ground, like a shadow slowly fading away. First his legs, then his torso, until only his head remained visible. And finally, he too disappeared. Terror paralyzed me for a moment, and a chill ran down my spine. It was as if the earth itself was devouring him, and his face, before disappearing completely, seemed to display a mix of peace and sadness. Gathering what little courage I had left, I approached the grave where he had disappeared. On the tombstone, I read the name of a woman, and on the next tomb, the name of a man. Both graves indicated they were spouses. The man visiting the cemetery was undoubtedly her deceased husband, buried alongside her. I felt a knot in my stomach, and my mind filled with questions and fears. I panicked and ran back to the security booth, locking myself inside. I spent the rest of the night praying and trembling. Cold sweat soaked my forehead, and every little noise made me jump in fear. The next night, I returned to work, unable to shake off my nerves. This time, I brought medals and religious images to protect myself. I felt these small things were my only defense against whatever was happening. At the same hour, I saw the same man standing at the gate, asking to come in. Knowing his true nature now, I hid in the booth and did not respond. His desperate cries to see his wife echoed in my ears, but I knew I couldn't let him in. After a moment, I heard the iron bars of the gate violently shaking, as if someone was shaking them with superhuman strength. The metallic sound reverberated in the air, and I felt my heart pounding out of my chest. I peered out the window of the booth and saw the man heading towards the grave again. I remained hidden, praying fervently until dawn broke. Every minute felt like an eternity, and fear kept me immobile. The next day, without hesitation, I quit my job and never went near that cemetery again. I didn't want to go through something like that ever again.
Thank you for journeying with us through the dark passages of these stories. If you enjoyed them, give us a like, share, and subscribe so you don't miss more tales of terror. Visit our channel to discover more incredible stories and let the fear continue. Remember, in the shadows, there are always more secrets to unveil. Until next time, where fear will once again be your companion.